Have you heard the story of the Order of the Garter? How Edward III was inspired by a lady dropping her garter and embarrassing herself? And if you know that story, and you can think of the title of the lady that apparently dropped her garter, do you recognize that title from another far darker story about Edward III?
Once upon a time, in history.
Most of us will be lucky to be remembered with just one story from our lifetime. Dates confirm that we were born and died, but a story, no matter how short or simple, shows that we lived. The lady who you are about to be introduced to can be found in two stories about Edward III. In one, her humiliation becomes inspiration for a man. In the other, she is the victim of a despicable act. Despite so little known of her, I invite you to know the human being at the heart of these stories, whose name was used to assist in displaying the brilliance or horror of her king. And then we shall discuss if they happened at all. Due to the nature of today's topic, you can find content warnings in the description. But now, let me introduce you to Catherine Grandison, the Countess of Salisbury, because this is not Edward III's story. This is her story. Grand beginnings. Disclaimer. The following HERstory discusses sexual assault and includes a line of graphic detail. It also includes several men named William, which may be a cause for confusion. Now, on with the story. Catherine was born around 1305. Her birth year is not certain, often written as 1304, but this seems to be an assumption strangely based on her future husband's birth year, as it seems evident she was only a few years his junior. As her surname of Grandison suggests, she descended from the Grandison family, a family well known within royal circles, with men so often standing close to the king. Her father was William de Grandison, an English noble and a member of the household of Edmund Crouchback, and her mother was Sibella de Tregoth, who little is known of. Thanks to her parents, Catherine came from a grand brood of children, with her father known to have had at least 15 children. I say known as it's quite likely that short-lived children weren't recorded. And of this brood, Catherine was the 8th born of her 10 full siblings, with the other 5 being older and mothered by a different woman. Nothing is known of Catherine's childhood, and we are left to assume that she received the education and took part in the pastimes fitting her status. Our first recording of her is, of course, her marriage. And she married well, though it wouldn't be for a decade that this marriage's true fortune would come to fruition. She was around 16 years old when she married William Montagu, who was born in 1301. 5 years in, they'd welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth. From 1328 to 1330, Catherine would welcome a child every year. William, Sybil, and finally, John. It was in 1330 that fortunes would rain upon the family, because in this year Catherine's husband assisted the young King Edward III in overthrowing his regents and ascending to full power. At this time, if Catherine had a care for her husband, she would have been greatly worried for his safety. This is, if he even allowed her to know of the plot. William Montagu became a firm favourite of the king, and it is assumed that Catherine accompanied her husband to royal events, including jousts and celebrations. For the rest of the decade, the only thing known for sure about Catherine's life is that she welcomed 2 more children. Philippa, in 1332, likely named after Queen Philippa, and Agnes, birth date unknown. We will hope she had a peaceful period, relishing the privileges coming her way, for it is the following decade where misfortune seems to repeatedly beat her. A deplorable decade. We now enter the most hellacious and last decade of Catherine's life. That is, if all tales are true. The following tale, dating to 1341, was famously recorded by Le Bel 15 years after the incident. To immediately place reliability in question, Le Bel incorrectly names Catherine. She is not recognised as Catherine, Countess of Salisbury. She's Alice, Countess of Salisbury. There is no sure answer as to where this mistake could have originated. But the argument that Le Bel is a reliable source comes from a respectable fact about his chronicling. Le Bel is thought to be one of the first or the first to interview others. He notes his sources, including the king's valet. But let's get into the story. It's 1341, and Alice, as Catherine is named, is residing in Wark in her husband's northern castle, which is governed by her nephew, confusingly, also named William Montagu, same as Catherine's husband and her eldest son. Her husband is away in France. The castle is seized by the Scots, but nephew William escapes to reach the king and his army in Newcastle. He pleads for the king to send his army to rescue Catherine, to which the king agrees and succeeds. Apparently, King Edward hasn't seen his best friend's wife since their wedding day. For all to see, he is instantly besotted with her and tries to coax her into bed with him, but she graciously refuses. It seems Edward was not too offended, though, nor was he deterred, as he invites Catherine and her husband to a great tournament in London. Catherine seems to be aware of the king's intent and chooses modest garb as to not make herself too appealing, but at the tournament, Edward still finds her irresistible. And in the night, while Catherine's husband was away, Edward crept from his bedchamber to hers. He locked her ladies in the wardrobe and then tried to seduce Catherine, but again she rejected him. But no meant nothing to Edward, and clearly his friendship with William Montagu meant little as well. He gagged her so she may not cry for help, and then did as he wanted to her. Le Bel gruesomely records that the assault was so savage that he left her battered, bleeding from the nose, mouth, and elsewhere, and remarks, which was for her great damage and great pity. The king left the following day and returned to London ashamed of himself. The problem with this account is that there is multiple faults. For one, are we really to believe that the king hasn't seen his best friend's wife in 20 years? In 2 decades, she had never attended a court event. She didn't attend his wedding to Philippa. Catherine's children spent time in the royal nursery. Her son William knew the king's eldest son, the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, quite well, and yet Catherine had never made an appearance at court. There is also the fact that Catherine is listed as the governess of the king's ward, Joan of Kent, who is noted to have been brought up with the royal children. And what of this nephew named William? Of Catherine's husband's siblings, none are known to have a son named William Montagu. In fact, the only other William Montagu besides her husband that was alive at this point was Catherine's son, who was 13 and very unlikely to have been governing his father's castle, and was more likely part of the king's court, as previously said. To follow this, Le Bel states Catherine and William had no heir, despite them having 2 thriving sons. And these are just some of the more minor faults with this account. This account is believed to be French propaganda, a fabricated black smear against the king, with Catherine's name, or really her title as she's referred to as Alice, is just collateral damage. So perhaps Le Bel's account is entirely false. Or perhaps, quite darkly, it's graphically embellished truth, accompanied by some incorrect identifications. In the early years of the 1340s, Catherine and William's high status permitted them to arrange an excellent marriage for their eldest son. The king, wanting to show his gratitude to the family, gave them the hand of his ward and cousin, the previously mentioned Joan of Kent. Catherine would have been greatly pleased to see her son marry so well, and to know that any grandchildren would descend from a king, as Joan of Kent was a granddaughter of Edward I. Unfortunately for the family, Catherine's new daughter-in-law held a secret that would be brought to the surface later in the decade. Until then, a tragedy was to befall the family. Catherine's husband had had an excellent military career, despite issues with fundings. In 1343, he had successfully conquered the Isle of Man, which had previously been held by the Scots. Thus, in January of 1344, he was held in high regard and likely expected to win when he took part in a jousting match at the King's Tournament. But, according to the chronicler Adam Murramouth, Montague was dealt wounds that would prove fatal. He would pass away on the 30th of January 1344, his titles and estates to be inherited by his eldest son. Catherine was now a widow. 4 years later, in 1348, Catherine may have attended a court ball. Assuming all is true and not a legend, Catherine was dancing with the king when her garter, holding up her stockings, came loose and fell to the ground. This was likely very embarrassing, as garters were more associated with men on the account that when worn they could be seen due to their short tunics. For women, they were hidden beneath their skirts, and for others to see their garter, it would be quite intimate. The king, looking to save the lady's reputation, picked up the garter and declared, "Shame to him that thinks evil of it." This instance is said to be what inspired the Order of the Garter, and his words became the motto. In recent years, this story has had another layer added: witchcraft. Egyptologist Margaret Murray states that a green garter is a sign of a high-ranking witch, worn like a badge of honour. Gerald Gardner, the famous Wiccan, also cited this story, and this has led to a very small number of people believing that Catherine was a witch. But for the basic story itself, many historians think it to be just a legend. If it's not, it's also not certain that it was Catherine who dropped her garter, with the other suspected lady to have been her daughter-in-law, Joan of Kent. This story was most famously recorded by the chronicler Froissart. But speaking of Joan, in the same year a familiar face arrived at the English court. It was the Montague family steward, Thomas Holland, and he had been away for 7 years on campaign and arrived home with a complete shock. His wife was married to someone else. The full story of this is a very interesting one, but as it holds so little focus on Catherine, we won't do a deep dive. But in short, Catherine likely felt a multitude of negative emotions when Thomas placed his claim as the husband of Joan of Kent, claiming that Joan had married him before she married Catherine's son. Catherine may have felt betrayed, fearful for scandal, but certainly and simply angry. This would all lead to a court case and Catherine standing fully by her son, and this may have included when he locked himself and his bigamous wife in a castle and refused to free her. To Catherine's dismay, her son's marriage was deemed invalid, Thomas won, and Joan returned to him, who she would have married when she was no more than 12 years old and he was in his early 20s. And that was the final story we have of Catherine's life, because it's in the following year, the decade's final year, on the 23rd of November, that Catherine would pass away at around 45 years old. We know nothing of her passing, including cause of death. As the plague had reached England the previous year, it's possible she was a victim. But the argument to this is that her will was completed 7 months prior to her death, so it's more likely she suffered from a long-term illness and suspected that death was on her shoulder for quite a while. Catherine's final resting place is suspected to be where the majority of the Salisbury Earls were buried, Bisham Priory for Austin Canons at Bisham, Berkshire. Catherine was survived by all her known children. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and drop a comment. It all helps build my channel. The next episode is planned to be about a little girl you've probably never heard of, but trust me, you are definitely familiar with the vanishing or perhaps murder of her young husband. And if you have TikTok, you can find me there as Once Upon a Time in History, and you can join in on my history rambles. My social links and my sources for today's episode are available in the description. See you next time, history nerds, for another tale from history.